The sky over Oakhaven did not hold the sun, it held a grudge. It was a vast, gangrenous expanse of bruised purple and charcoal gray, choked by the thick, rhythmic exhalations of 1,000 smokestacks. Below this suffocating canopy stood the Blackwood Canning Company, a windowless monolith of corrugated steel and weeping rivets that seemed to have clawed its way out of the earth's darkest mantle. It did not merely exist in the landscape, it occupied it like a malignant tumor, pulsating with a low-frequency hum that rattled the teeth of any soul unfortunate enough to walk its perimeter. Alex adjusted the strap of his canvas bag, his knuckles raw and stained with a permanent patina of machine oil and soot. Beside him, his grandmother, Margareth, shuffled through the knee-deep industrial fog that clung to the gravel path. The fog was not water vapor, it was a chemical soup, tasting of bitter sulfur and the copper tang of ancient, dried blood. It felt thick against the skin, like invisible, greasy fingers probing for a way into the lungs. "Don't look at the chimneys, Alex," Margareth whispered, her voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering over a tombstone. Alex glanced at her. Margaretha's face was a map of deep-set furrows, her skin the color of parched parchment. But it was her eyes that truly unnerved him, vast, milky orbs clouded by cataracts that seemed to pulse with an inner, rhythmic light. In the gloom of the Oakhaven morning, those white spheres glowed with a faint, bioluminescent hue, as if she were seeing a world layered beneath the rust and grime. "I'm just looking at the clock, Nan," Alex lied, his voice tight. "We're 5 minutes early." "The clock is a lie," she hissed, stopping dead in her tracks. She turned her head toward the factory gates, her blind gaze fixed on the towering iron archway. "The machine doesn't keep time. It keeps count. Every second is a heartbeat stolen from the living to feed the iron. Can't you hear it? The ground, it's parched, Alex. It has an unquenchable thirst today." Alex shivered, and it wasn't from the biting cold. He took her arm, guiding her forward. He had grown used to her cryptic rants since the sickness began to take the town, but lately, her words felt less like madness and more like a warning. As they reached the gates, the smell hit them, a nauseating wave of metallic rot. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse that had been scrubbed with bleach but failed to hide the iron-heavy ghost of what had transpired within. The Blackwood Canning Company was the lifeblood of Oakhaven, yet it felt like a parasite. They processed protein, or so the labels said, but no one in town ever saw the livestock arrive. There were no lowing cattle, no squealing swine, only the endless convoys of windowless trucks that arrived in the dead of night, their engines idling like growling beasts in the dark. The heavy iron doors groaned open, a sound like a giant's teeth grinding together. As they stepped into the foyer, the transition was absolute. The outside world, grim as it was, felt like a memory. Inside, the air was pressurized, heavy with the humidity of a tropical swamp and the sterile sting of industrial cleaners. "Silence and sinew," a voice boomed. Alex stiffened. Standing by the punch clock was Edgar, the floor supervisor. He was a man who seemed constructed of spare parts, long, gangly limbs, a torso that sat too heavy on his hips, and a face that was perpetually slick with a thin film of sweat. His eyes were small, dark, and devoid of empathy, like those of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Clock in, 742. "Clock in, 109, Edgar commanded, referring to them by their station numbers rather than names. Alex slid their cards into the slot. Clack-shink. The sound was violent, a mechanical bite that felt like it was marking their souls rather than their time. "The master is watching the quotas today," Edgar whispered as Alex passed him. He leaned in close, the smell of sour coffee and something metallic wafting from his breath. "The machines are temperamental. They don't like it when the pace slows. Tell the old woman to keep her eyes on the belt and her mouth shut." Margareth didn't flinch. As they walked toward the locker rooms, she leaned toward Alex, her milky eyes flashing. "He smells of grease and shadows, Alex. He's already half hollow. The iron has started to eat him from the inside out." "Nan, please," Alex begged, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Just get through the shift. We need the credits." We need the rations. They entered the main floor, and the scale of the horror became apparent. The iron womb was a cathedral of industry. Massive, soot-blackened pistons plunged from the ceiling like the stomping feet of a god. Miles of copper piping snaked across the walls, hissing and spitting jets of white steam that obscured the rafters. Beneath it all was the hum, a deep, visceral throb that vibrated through the soles of their boots, synchronized with the pounding of their own hearts. It was a living, breathing entity. The gears were its teeth, the conveyor belts its tongue, and the roaring furnaces its scorched, hollow belly. Every worker moved in a choreographed trance, their faces obscured by heavy rubber masks and goggles, their bodies draped in stained aprons. They were the white blood cells of this mechanical titan, keeping the infection of humanity at bay while the work continued. Alex led Margareth to her station at the sorting line. Above them, a series of red emergency lights flickered rhythmically, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance independently of the objects casting them. "Where's Miriam?" Alex whispered, glancing toward the station next to his. The station was empty. A single, rubber glove lay on the floor, curled like a dead hand. Margaretha's breath hitched. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cold steel of the sorting table. Her cataracts began to pulse faster, the milky light within them swirling like a trapped storm. "The ground, Alex," she moaned softly, her voice nearly lost in the cacophony of the grinding gears. "I told you. It was thirsty. It didn't wait for the night. It took her while the sun was still trying to rise." Alex looked at the empty space where his friend should have been. A cold dread, sharper than any industrial blade, settled in his gut. He looked toward the back of the hall, where the massive primary grinders, the holy trinity of the factory, stood shrouded in thick, red-tinged steam. The sound coming from them was different today. It wasn't just the crunch of bone and fiber, it was a wet, sloppy sound, punctuated by a high-pitched metallic whine that sounded suspiciously like a human scream caught in a throat of steel. "Get to work," a voice hissed from the shadows. Alex turned to see Anna and Bella at the next table over. Their eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed straight ahead. They didn't look at him. They didn't look at the empty station. They simply reached into the black bins and began sorting the raw, pinkish-gray mounds of protein that the belt delivered with a relentless, mechanical rhythm. The shift had begun. The Blackwood Canning Company had opened its maw, and as the first containers of raw material began to spill onto the belts, Alex realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror that the smell of Melati, Miriam's favorite perfume, was rising from the grinder, faint but unmistakable, beneath the stench of sulfur and blood. The mechanical god was hungry. And today, it was eating someone they loved. The rhythm of the sorting line was a hypnotic, soul-eroding pulse. For 3 hours, Alex's hands moved with a mechanical autonomy he didn't know he possessed, grabbing cold, gelatinous mounds of protein and tossing them into the designated chutes. But his mind was a storm of static and jasmine. Every time the steam hissed from the overhead valves, he expected to hear Miriam's laughter, a sound that had once been the only thing capable of piercing the factory's industrial gloom. Now, there was only the wet thwack of meat hitting the belt. When the first liturgy break, a 20-minute window of mandated silence and forced hydration, was signaled by a low, mournful siren, Alex didn't head for the canteen. Instead, he slipped away from the line, ducking behind a row of vibrating vats filled with brining chemicals. The locker room was a sepulchral transition zone, a place where the workers shed their humanity and donned their servitude. It was a long, narrow hall of pitted steel lockers, illuminated by flickering fluorescent tubes that buzzed like dying insects. The floor was perpetually damp, coated in a thin, slippery film of gray condensation and boot-tracked filth. Alex moved toward the back, where the light struggled to reach. He counted the numbers, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. 400, 402. Locker 404. The door wasn't just open, it had been violated. The thin metal was bent outward, as if something inside had tried to claw its way out, or something outside had been desperate to reach in. The lock lay on the floor, its shackle snapped like a brittle bone. As Alex stepped closer, the sensory dissonance hit him with the force of a physical blow. From the dark interior of the locker drifted the faint, heartbreaking scent of jasmine, Miriam's perfume, a cheap, floral spray she used to mask the stench of the factory. But the jasmine was being strangled. It was being drowned out by a thick, cloying odor of rotting offal, a smell so visceral and stagnant it felt like a coating of grease on the back of Alex's throat. "Miriam," he whispered, the name feeling heavy and forbidden in the silent room. He reached into the locker. Her work jacket was still there, but it was shredded, the heavy canvas torn into ribbons. On the floor of the locker sat her boots, neatly placed, but filled with a dark, viscous fluid that shimmered with an oily, rainbow sheen. He pulled out a small, framed photograph, a picture of Miriam and her younger brother at the Oakhaven Fair. The glass was shattered. But it wasn't the cracks that froze Alex's blood, it was the fact that Miriam's face had been meticulously scratched out. Not by a knife, but by something that left deep, jagged grooves in the paper, as if a set of iron teeth had bitten the image of her soul away. "It's a vacancy, 742. Nothing more." The voice was cold, flat, and devoid of the vibrations that make a human voice recognizable. Alex spun around, his back hitting the dented lockers with a loud, metallic clang. Edgar stood at the end of the aisle. In the stuttering light, the supervisor looked less like a man and more like a wax effigy left too close to a fire. His skin was translucent, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for his neck. His eyes were wide and unblinking, hollow pits that didn't seem to reflect the light, but rather absorbed it. "She's gone, Edgar," Alex said, his voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rising fury. "Her locker is trashed. There's blood in her boots. What happened to her?" Edgar didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. "In the Blackwood Company, there is no what happened. There is only the quota. Locker 404 is scheduled for sanitization. The contents are now property of the Waste Reclamation Department. She's a person, not waste." Alex shouted, the sound echoing hollowly off the steel walls. Edgar took a single step forward. His movement was wrong, too smooth, too silent, as if he were being pulled along a track. "A person is a collection of components, Alex. Muscle, bone, spirit. When the components fail to meet the output requirements, they are redistributed. Return to your station. The machines are growing restless with the delay." Alex wanted to strike him. He wanted to peel back that waxy skin and see if there was anything left inside besides gears and black bile. But as he stepped toward Edgar, he felt a sudden, localized drop in temperature. It became so cold his breath misted in the air. He looked past Edgar, toward the massive steam pipes that ran along the ceiling of the locker room. The pipes were sweating, thick droplets of condensation rolling down their rusted surfaces. But on the largest pipe, the moisture was behaving strangely. The condensation was swirling, forming a shape in the gray mist. Alex's eyes widened. A figure was emerging from the steam, a pale, translucent apparition. It had the height and build of Miriam, draped in a tattered shroud of what looked like industrial plastic. But where the face should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface of swirling white vapor. It had no eyes to cry with, no mouth to scream with. It was a blank slate of agony. The faceless thing raised a hand missing a finger, and pointed toward the floor, toward the main processing bay where the primary grinders roared. "Alex." The voice didn't come from the apparition's mouth, it vibrated inside Alex's own skull, a wet, gargling sound that felt like it was bubbling up from a throat filled with blood. "Alex, we are the harvest." In an instant, a valve on the pipe hissed violently, a plume of white steam erupting and obscuring the figure. When the mist cleared, there was nothing there but the rhythmic drip of water hitting the floor. "Return to your station," Edgar repeated. His voice had dropped an octave, vibrating with a subterranean power that made the lockers rattle. His skin seemed to ripple, as if something large and many-legged was crawling just beneath the surface of his chest. Alex backed away, his hands shaking so violently he had to shove them into his pockets. His fingers brushed against something hard and cold, the ring he had found in the grinder earlier. It felt unnaturally heavy, a leaden weight of evidence that he was no longer just a worker. He was a witness. He walked past Edgar, feeling the supervisor's dead gaze tracking him like a predator. As he reached the exit, he looked back one last time at locker 404. The scent of jasmine was gone. The smell of the offal had won. But as he stepped back onto the factory floor, the sound of the Holy Trinity grinders reached his ears. They didn't sound like machines anymore. They sounded like a choir of 1,000 voices, all screaming in a discordant, mechanical harmony. And among them, he could hear a new tone, a high, sharp note that vibrated with the rhythm of Miriam's final, terrified heartbeat. Alex looked at his grandmother, Margareth, who was still standing at her station, her milky eyes fixed on the steam. She began to hum a low, dissonant tune, her fingers dancing over the raw meat on the belt as if she were reading Braille. "The belly is full, Alex," she whispered as he took his place beside her. "But the teeth are still hungry for the one who holds the knife." Alex gripped the edge of the sorting table until his knuckles turned white. He looked toward the glass-walled office high above the floor, where the silhouette of John stood, watching them like a dark god. The hunt had begun, but John didn't realize yet that he wasn't the only hunter in the iron womb. The Blackwood Canning Company did not operate on electricity alone, it ran on the friction of suffering. By the 4th hour of the shift, the ambient noise of the factory had shifted from a roar to a rhythmic, industrial chant. The pistons were percussion, the hissing steam was the woodwind section of a dying god's orchestra. But it was grinder 4 that held the melody, a low, wet churning that sounded like a titan chewing on a mouthful of gravel and gristle. Then, the music broke. With a sound like a gunshot echoing through a cathedral, grinder 4 seized. The massive, serrated steel drums within its throat groaned, a screech of metal on metal that set Alex's teeth on edge and made the very marrow of his bones ache. A foul, thick smoke, smelling of scorched hair and rancid fat, began to billow from its primary intake. The line stopped. For a moment, the silence was more terrifying than the noise. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. "Station 742. Edgar's voice sliced through the stillness. He appeared from the haze of the upper catwalks, his waxy skin glistening under the strobing red emergency lights. He pointed a long, trembling finger at the mouth of the stalled machine. "Clear the obstruction. Now. The quota is bleeding." "It's too hot, Edgar," Alex said, his voice cracking. "The internal blades are still pressurized. We need a full lockout, at least an hour to cool." "The machine does not wait for the sun to set, and neither do we," Edgar hissed, descending the ladder with a fluid, unnatural grace. He reached into his belt and pulled out a heavy, rusted iron wrench, thrusting it toward Alex. "Get inside. Purge the clog. Or you'll find yourself on the next truck out of Oakhaven, and your grandmother with you." Alex looked at Margareth. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring into the dark, gaping maw of grinder 4. Her milky eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until they were mere pinpricks of black in a sea of white. Her lips were moving, a silent, frantic prayer or a curse, he couldn't tell. "I'll go," Alex whispered, the words feeling like a death sentence. He climbed the steel steps to the maintenance hatch. The heat radiating from the machine was a physical weight, a shimmering wall of air that tasted of iron and lubricant. He unbolted the circular door, and a gust of stale, humid air escaped, the breath of a tomb. Armed with only a dim flashlight and the heavy wrench, Alex lowered himself into the throat of the beast. The interior of grinder 4 was a nightmare of obsidian geometry. Massive, interlocking teeth, each the size of a man's forearm and honed to a razor edge, spiraled down into a dark abyss. Everything was coated in a thick, black ichor, a mixture of industrial grease and organic residue that felt like cold slime against his palms. He crawled deeper, his flashlight beam dancing over the serrated edges. The space was claustrophobic, the steel walls pressing in on him. He could hear the rest of the factory humming outside, but in here, there was only the sound of his own frantic breathing and a strange, distant thumping, like a heartbeat echoing through the metal. "Alex." He froze. The voice was a wet gurgle, coming from somewhere beneath the secondary blade assembly. "Alex, find me." He shone his light down into the narrow gap between two massive rollers. There, wedged deep into a groove, was the obstruction. It looked like a tangled mass of graying fiber and dark cloth, fused together by the heat of the friction. Alex reached down, his fingers trembling as they brushed the mass. It was warm, unnaturally warm. He gripped the edge of the clog and pulled. The metal shrieked. It wasn't the sound of the machine, it was the sound of the steel reacting to the touch. As the mass came free, Alex felt a sharp, stinging pain in his hand. He pulled back, his flashlight illuminating the prize he had dislodged. It wasn't a bundle of rags. It was a hand. Or what was left of one. The flesh was a sickly, translucent gray, the skin stripped away in jagged ribbons to reveal the ivory white of the bone beneath. The fingers were twisted into impossible angles, crushed by the weight of the rollers. But it was the middle finger that caught the light. There, biting deep into the swollen, mangled flesh, was a silver ring. A simple, polished band with a tiny, cracked diamond. Miriam's ring. The realization hit Alex like a physical blow to the stomach. The protein they had been sorting, the stew they had been forced to eat, it wasn't just meat. It was her. They were turning her, and God knows how many others, into a commodity. Suddenly, a sound erupted from outside the machine. It was Margareth. She had begun to chant. Her voice, usually a frail rasp, had transformed into a deep, guttural resonance that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the chest. The language was ancient, a jagged collection of glottal stops and sibilant hisses that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. Ika summonar. Ouroboros steel. The blood is the oil, the soul is the spark. Man. Stop. Alex screamed, his voice muffled by the steel walls. As the chant reached a crescendo, the machine responded. The heavy, dormant rollers beneath Alex began to vibrate. It wasn't the vibration of an engine starting, it was a rhythmic, predatory twitching. The internal lights of the grinder, which had been dead, suddenly flickered to life with a deep, arterial red glow. The walls of the machine began to pulse. The steel felt soft, almost like leather, as if the metal were transforming into muscle. Thump thump. Thump thump. The primary blades began to rotate. Slowly. Deliberately. Scree. The sound of metal shrieking against bone echoed through the chamber as the blades began to close the gap where Alex lay. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the greasy rollers. The hatch he had entered through seemed miles away, a tiny circle of dim light in an encroaching sea of red. Edgar! Open the hatch! It's starting up! Alex roared, his fingers clawing at the slick steel. Outside, Edgar stood paralyzed, his waxy face illuminated by the red strobes. He wasn't reaching for the emergency stop. He was watching Margareth. The old woman was swaying, her arms outstretched, her milky eyes now glowing with a terrifying, incandescent light. She was no longer a grandmother, she was a conductor, her hands tracing the lines of the factory's power as if she were weaving the very air. The machine must feed, Alex, she cried out, her voice overlapping with a dozen other spectral whispers. It has tasted the silver. It wants the gold of the living. A massive blade, jagged and stained with Miriam's blood, swung inches from Alex's shoulder, biting into the wall of the grinder with a shower of sparks. The heat was unbearable now, the smell of ozone and burning flesh filling the tiny space. Alex lunged for the hatch, his fingers catching the rim just as the secondary rollers began to spin with a high-pitched, hungry whine. He pulled himself out, tumbling onto the steel catwalk just as the hatch slammed shut with the force of a guillotine. He lay there, gasping for air, his lungs burning. He looked down at his hand. He was still clutching the mangled finger, the silver ring glinting mockingly in the red light. Grinder 4 roared back to life with a ferocity that shook the entire floor. It wasn't the sound of a fixed machine, it was the sound of a beast that had been teased and was now enraged. The symphony had resumed, but it was faster now, more aggressive. Alex looked up. Edgar was gone. Margareth stood at the edge of the catwalk, her back to the machines. She turned to look at Alex, and for a fleeting second, the milky film over her eyes cleared. "They don't just want our bodies, Alex," she whispered, her voice once again frail and terrified. "The thing under the floor, it's using the machines to build something. Something that can walk among us." She pointed a trembling hand toward the livestock elevator at the far end of the hall. "They're taking the best parts of Miriam down there. We have to go, Alex. Before the boss decides we are the dessert." Alex stood up, his gaze hardening as he looked at the ring in his hand. The grief was still there, but it was being forged into something sharper, something colder. He tucked the finger into his pocket, a grim relic of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. "We're not just going down there, Nan," Alex said, his voice as cold as the steel beneath his feet. "We're going to make sure this factory never hums again." High above, in the glass-walled office, the silhouette of John turned away from the window. He began to clap, a slow, rhythmic sound that was perfectly in time with the heartbeat of the factory. The symphony had reached its second movement. The siren that signaled the safety lunch did not sound like a call to rest, it was a long, low-frequency wail that mimicked the groan of a dying animal. In the Blackwood Canning Company, hunger was a secondary concern to compliance. The workers filed out of the processing bay, their movements synchronized by the lingering vibration of the machines in their bones. They moved toward the refectory, a room that sat in the very bowels of the factory, directly beneath the primary grinders. The refectory was a cathedral of cold, galvanized steel. There were no windows, only rows of long, communal tables bolted to the floor, their surfaces polished to a mirror shine that reflected the flickering, sickly yellow of the overhead sodium lamps. The air here was different, it was devoid of the sulfurous sting of the factory floor, replaced by something far more oppressive, the cloying, heavy scent of slow-simmered meat and iron. At the head of the center table sat John. He was dressed in a suit of such deep charcoal it appeared to absorb the light around him. His hands, long-fingered and tipped with unnaturally clean nails, rested on the steel surface. His skin looked like polished parchment stretched over a frame of obsidian. He did not speak as the workers took their seats. He merely watched, his eyes, two pits of dark, liquid shadow, tracking every flinch, every drop of sweat. Alex sat between Margareth and Anna. Across from them, Bella and Cindy stared at their empty stainless steel bowls with the hollowed-out expressions of the damned. No one spoke. In the iron womb, silence was the only grace allowed before the meal. "Family," John's voice finally broke the silence. It wasn't loud, yet it carried the weight of a falling guillotine. It was a smooth, melodic baritone that felt like a velvet glove over a fist of rusted nails. Progress requires unity. And unity requires a shared essence. Today, we celebrate a milestone in our production. We celebrate the harvest. He stood up, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, creeping toward the table like spilled ink. Two orderlies, their faces hidden behind heavy leather respirators, began to wheel in a massive, steaming cauldron. As the lid was lifted, a plume of thick, crimson vapor billowed toward the ceiling. The smell hit Alex like a physical blow. It was sweet, metallic, and sickeningly familiar. It was the scent of the locker room, the scent of the grinder, the scent of Miriam's jasmine perfume being burned away by the heat of the vats. John picked up a silver ladle and began to serve. He moved with a priest-like solemnity, pouring a thick, dark red stew into each worker's bowl. When he reached Alex, he paused. "You look pale, 742, John whispered, leaning in. His eyes suddenly flickered, a brief, terrifying flash of eldritch violet light pulsed deep within his pupils. "Perhaps you lack the necessary fortification." The ladle hit the bottom of Alex's bowl with a dull thud. A large, grayish-pink chunk of protein bobbed to the surface of the crimson broth. "Eat," John commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a psychic pressure that made Alex's hand move toward his spoon against his will. Alex looked down at the stew. It was a viscous, gelatinous slurry. He picked up a piece of the meat with his spoon. It didn't look like beef or pork. The fibers were too fine, the edges too jagged, as if they had been torn rather than cut. He could see the pale mapping of a vein running through the center of the piece, a delicate, lace-like structure that screamed of a complexity no animal possessed. Beside him, Margareth hadn't touched her spoon. She was staring at the steam, her milky eyes wide and vibrating. "The soul is in the marrow," she hissed under her breath, so low only Alex could hear. "He's sewing us together from the inside. Don't let the needle pass through you, Alex." "Eat, Alex," Anna whispered from his other side. Her voice was devoid of emotion, her eyes fixed on her own bowl as she rhythmically chewed, her jaw clicking with every movement. It makes the voices stop. It makes the machine feel like home. John was watching him, a thin, predatory smile playing on his lips. "Is something wrong? Is the texture not to your liking? I personally oversaw the rendering of this batch. It is special. A tribute to those who have given everything to the company." Alex felt the mangled finger in his pocket, the silver ring biting into his thigh. The realization was a cold, sharp blade in his mind. He wasn't just being forced to eat, he was being forced to participate in a desecration. This was the essence of Miriam. This was her dreams, her laughter, her fear, all rendered down into a high-protein sludge to fuel the very machines that had killed her. I'm not hungry," Alex managed to choke out. The temperature in the room plummeted. The steam from the bowls began to swirl in unnatural patterns, forming spectral, grasping hands that dissipated as soon as they touched the light. John stepped closer, his presence expanding until he seemed to tower over the table like an ancient, vengeful idol. To refuse the meal is to refuse the company. To refuse the company is to become raw material. Is that what you wish, Alex? To be the next special ingredient? John's hand came down on Alex's shoulder. It didn't feel like skin, it felt like a heavy, cold iron clamp. The violet light in John's eyes flared, casting long, demonic shadows across the steel walls. Alex felt a sudden, agonizing surge of hunger, not his own, but a foreign, parasitic craving that originated from John's touch. His stomach lurched, his mouth watering with a traitorous, primal urge. He lifted the spoon to his lips. The taste was an assault. It was cloying and rich, with an underlying tang of copper that coated his tongue like a film of blood. The texture was the worst part, rubbery and resilient, with a snap that felt like a tendon giving way between his teeth. It was familiar in a way that made his soul recoil. It was the texture of his own cheek, the texture of a life that had been warm and breathing only hours ago. He swallowed. It felt like swallowing a stone. "Good," John purred, his grip loosening. He turned his gaze to the rest of the room. "Communion is achieved. You are all part of the Blackwood lineage now. Her strength is your strength. Her silence is your silence." As the workers ate, a strange change came over them. The frantic trembling stopped. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a dull, glassy sheen. They began to chew in unison, a rhythmic, wet sound that echoed the thumping of the factory vats above. Bella began to weep, but she didn't stop eating. The tears ran down her face and into her bowl, mixing with the crimson broth. Cindy was whispering to her stew, her fingers tracing the rim of the bowl as if she were stroking a lover's face. Alex felt a cold, oily sensation spreading from his stomach to his limbs. His vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening. For a moment, he didn't see the refectory. He saw the sub-basement. He saw the livestock, those titanic, weeping masses of flesh, and they were calling to him. They were his brothers now. They were his sisters. "Alex." It was Miriam's voice. It wasn't coming from the steam this time. It was coming from inside him. A soft, wet whisper vibrating against his ribs. "Help us, he's still eating." Margareth suddenly grabbed Alex's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Her milky eyes were fixed on John, who was now walking toward the exit, his silhouette merging with the shadows. "He thinks he's the master," Margareth hissed, her voice crackling with a sudden, vengeful energy. "But he's just the butcher's boy. The real hunger is deeper. And it's tired of being fed in bowls." She looked at Alex, and for the first time, he saw a spark of something other than madness in her white orbs. It was a cold, calculating fury. "Tonight, Alex. We don't just stop the machine. We feed it something it can't digest. We feed it the one who holds the ladle." As the siren wailed to signal the end of the lunch, Alex stood up. He felt heavier, his movements sluggish, but his mind was a searing white flame of hatred. He looked at the empty bowl, at the crimson stains on the steel table. John was the architect of this hell. He was the one who had turned their grief into a meal. "Dessert," Alex whispered, the word tasting like iron on his tongue. "I'll make sure he's the dessert." High above them, the factory hummed a new, expectant note. The iron wound was satisfied for now, but the great feat had only just begun. The crimson communion had left a residue in Alex's soul that no amount of industrial soap could scrub away. As he returned to the sorting line, his limbs felt leaden, his joints popping with a metallic grit as if the very calcium in his bones was being replaced by iron ore. The factory floor was a haze of shimmering heat and sulfurous fog, but to Alex's heightened, tainted senses, the world was beginning to fray at the edges. The rhythm of the machines had changed. It was no longer a mechanical drone, it was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, deep beneath the concrete foundations. Beside him, Margareth was no longer sorting. Her hands, gnarled like the roots of an ancient, poison tree, rested flat on the vibrating steel of the conveyor belt. She wasn't looking at the meat. She wasn't looking at anything in this dimension. Her cataracts had ceased to be mere clouds of dead tissue, they were glowing with an intense, pearlescent radiance, swirling with the nebulous energy of a trapped galaxy. "Nan?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. "Nan, we have to keep moving. Edgar is watching." "Edgar is a tick on the height of a god, Alex," Margareth rasped. Her voice didn't sound like her own anymore. It carried a layered, polyphonic quality, as if 1,000 ancestors were speaking through her vocal cords at once. "He sees only the skin. I am seeing the viscera." Suddenly, the overhead sodium lights flickered and died, plunged the floor into a Stygian darkness, yet, for Alex, the world didn't go dark. It turned a translucent, ghostly blue. He looked at the factory walls, but he no longer saw corrugated steel and rivets. He saw veins. Thick, pulsating conduits of dark fluid throbbed beneath the surface of the walls. The massive steam pipes were no longer iron, they were glistening, translucent intestines, churning with a slurry of half-digested spirit and biological waste. The entire Blackwood Canning Company was breathing. The floor heaved beneath his boots with the slow, tectonic rhythm of a massive diaphragm. "Do you see it now, little bird?" Margareth turned her glowing gaze toward him. Through her eyes, Alex saw the veil of the material world tear open. This is not a factory. It is a digestive tract. We are standing in the throat of the great devourer. She reached out and grabbed Alex's hand. The contact was like an electric shock of cold, ancient memory. Visions flooded Alex's mind, images of Oakhaven long before the first brick was laid. He saw a yawning pit in the earth, an abyss that had existed since the stars were young and cold. Something slept down there, a subterranean entity of vast, incomprehensible hunger. An Ouroboros of flesh and shadow that had been dreaming of the taste of man for eons. The Blackwood family didn't build this to make money, Margareth chanted, her body swaying as if caught in a psychic gale. They built it as a feeding tube. Every gear that turns, every piston that falls, is a tooth in a jaw that spans miles. They call it industry. I call it an altar. She pointed her finger toward the massive boilers at the center of the hall. In the spectral blue light, Alex saw the souls of the disappeared. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense, they were being woven. He saw Miriam. Or what was left of her essence. Her spirit looked like a glowing, golden thread being spun into the spinning flywheels of the generators. Her screams were being converted into the very electricity that lit the halls. The workers who vanished weren't just killed, their consciousness was rendered down into spirit fat, a metaphysical lubricant that allowed the machines to operate beyond the laws of physics. They are part of the steel now, Margareth whispered, a single tear of pure, liquid light rolling down her withered cheek. The factory is reinforced with the agony of the innocent. That is why it never breaks. That is why it never stops. It is a living god made of rusted iron and recycled souls. Alex fell to his knees, his mind buckling under the weight of the cosmic horror. He could feel the entity beneath the floor, the livestock prime. It was a mass of undulating, cancerous growth the size of a city, its many mouths waiting for the protein to be piped down from the grinders above. Why? Alex choked out. Why us? Because we are the enriched. Margareth said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. Our bloodlines go back to the first hunters of this valley. We have the old salt in our marrow. To the thing below, we are the only meat that tastes of heaven. John, he is the high priest. He filters the suffering. He refines the flavor through the machines before he delivers the meal to his master. Suddenly, the blue light snapped back to reality. The sodium lamps hummed back to life, casting their sickly yellow glare over the mundane horror of the sorting line. Margareth slumped against the table, her eyes returning to their dull, milky white. She looked older, more fragile, as if the vision had drained the very oil from her lamps. Edgar was suddenly there, his shadow looming over them. Station 742. Station 109. You have ceased movement for 60 seconds. That is 60 seconds of theft from the company. Alex looked up at Edgar. He didn't see a supervisor anymore. He saw a parasite, a hollowed-out husk that was being used by the factory to maintain its own internal stasis. Edgar's skin was so thin Alex could almost see the black, oily sludge pumping through his veins instead of blood. We were just catching our breath, Alex said, his voice cold and flat. He felt a new strength in his limbs, a desperate, vengeful fire. Edgar leaned in, his dead eyes searching Alex's face. The air in Blackwood is not for catching. It is for breathing so you can work. If the old woman cannot stand, she will be moved to the rendering vats by the end of the shift. Do you understand? I understand everything now, Edgar, Alex said, staring directly into the supervisor's hollow pits. Edgar hesitated, a flicker of something, perhaps a remnant of human fear, passing over his waxy features. He grunted and moved on, his gait stiff and mechanical. Margareth grabbed Alex's sleeve, her fingers digging in with surprising force. He's coming, Alex. The boss. He felt the veil tear. He knows I've shown you the truth. Alex looked toward the glass office. John was standing at the railing, his silhouette dark against the glowing red lights of the machinery. He wasn't looking at the quotas. He was looking directly at Alex. He raised a hand, 2 fingers extended in a mock blessing that felt like a curse. The machines are the body, Alex whispered to his grandmother, the words of the vision still echoing in his mind. And the souls are the fuel. But every machine has a breaking point, Nan. Every engine can be made to run too hot until it melts its own heart. You have the ring, Alex, Margareth whispered, her voice regaining its mystic edge. The silver is a conductor. It still holds a piece of Miriam's will. Use it. Use the silver to bridge the gap between the steel and the fire. As the sorting belt lurched back into motion, delivering a fresh pile of steaming, anonymous meat, Alex reached into his pocket and gripped the silver ring. It felt hot, searingly hot, vibrating in sync with the subterranean heartbeat of the entity below. The factory wanted a sacrifice. It wanted a symphony of screams. Alex looked at the conveyor belt leading down into the darkness of the sub-basement. If the thing below wants a meal, Alex muttered, his eyes fixed on John's silhouette, we're going to give it the one thing it's never tasted. We're going to give it the butcher himself. The iron womb groaned, a sound that started in the foundations and ended in the rafters. It felt like an invitation. Or a challenge. The steam purge occurred every 6 hours, a violent, necessary exhaling of the factory's overpressurized lungs. For 3 minutes, the processing floor vanished behind a wall of opaque, scalding white vapor. It was the only time the eyes of the company, the myriad of cameras and the watchful, waxy gaze of Edgar, were blinded. Now, Margareth whispered, her voice cutting through the hiss of the valves. Alex gripped her arm, his fingers brushing the coarse fabric of her grease-stained shawl. They didn't move toward the exits where the other workers were huddled, waiting for the mist to clear. Instead, they moved toward the back of the facility, past the humming cooling towers, to a door marked with a symbol Alex had never seen in any safety manual, a black circle bisected by 3 jagged lines, resembling a claw or a crown of thorns. The door didn't have a handle. It had a diaphragm, a puckered ring of rusted iron that dilated as Margareth pressed her palm against a hidden sensor. As they stepped through, the sound of the factory floor changed. The mechanical roar didn't vanish, it became muffled, transformed into a wet, rhythmic thumping, like the sound of a heart beating inside a tub of water. The descent was not via a staircase, but a service lift that felt more like a cage. As it rattled downward, the temperature rose. It wasn't the dry heat of the furnaces above, but a humid, suffocating warmth that carried the stench of 1,000 unwashed bodies and the cloying, sweet rot of overripe fruit. The air tastes of copper, Alex gagged, covering his mouth with his sleeve. It is the breath of the forgotten, Margareth replied. Her cataracts were dimming now, replaced by a subtle, rhythmic twitching of her eyelids. We are entering the gut, Alex. This is where the protein fulfills its purpose. The lift stopped with a bone-jarring lurch. The doors slid open to reveal the sub-basement labyrinth. If the floors above were industrial, this place was biological. The walls were lined with pipes, but they weren't made of PVC or copper. They were semi-translucent conduits, pulsating with a dark, viscous fluid. The floor beneath their boots was no longer concrete. It was covered in a thick layer of gray, spongy lichen that squelched with every step, exuding a yellowish slime that smelled of ammonia. As they moved deeper into the labyrinth, the architecture began to shift. The straight lines of the factory gave way to organic curves. The ceiling was low, draped with long, weeping tendrils of what looked like raw nerve endings, twitching as they sensed the heat of the intruders. Look, Margareth whispered, pointing toward a massive, vaulted chamber ahead. Alex stopped, his breath hitching in his throat. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the horror that John had spent decades hiding. They were called the livestock. In a series of massive, open vats carved directly into the bedrock, sat titanic masses of undulating flesh. They were mountains of muscle and fat, lacking limbs or skeletal structure, yet possessing a terrifying, sentient vitality. Their skin was a translucent, bruised purple, stretched so thin in places that Alex could see the chaotic tangle of organs churning within. But it was the faces that broke his mind. Across the surface of these meat mountains, hundreds of human eyes were embedded. Some were wide and weeping with thick, milky sores, others were squeezed shut in eternal agony. They weren't just decorative, they were moving. Thousands of pupils tracked Alex as he walked past, a silent, collective plea echoing in the humid air. My God, Alex whispered, his knees buckling. They're made of people. Not just made of them, Margareth said, her voice trembling with a rare flash of grief. They are them. This is the final stage of redistribution. When the soul is woven into the machine above, the flesh is brought down here to be grafted onto these things. These are the avatars of the entities John serves. Dead gods that require a constant infusion of human biology to keep their consciousness anchored to this world. Suddenly, a series of massive overhead pipes, the ones Alex had seen connected to Grinder 4, shuddered. With a wet, explosive sound, a deluge of the raw protein slurry began to pour into the vats. The livestock reacted with a sickening, collective spasm. Mouths, jagged, toothless sphincters that opened at random points on the flesh masses, began to suckle at the falling meat. The sound was a cacophony of slurping and wet gurgling that made Alex's stomach turn. "They're feeding," Alex realized, horror dawning on him. "The meal we ate, we were just sharing the scraps with these monsters." "John is fattening them," Margareth said. She walked toward the edge of the nearest vat, her hand reaching out toward a cluster of eyes that seemed to recognize her. "He's preparing them for the ascension. Once they reach a certain mass, once they have consumed enough spirit-enriched protein, they will no longer need the factory. They will simply wake up." Alex shone his light on the side of the vat. There, half submerged in the pulsating sludge, was a familiar shape. It was a head, the hair still long and matted with grease, the face partially fused into the side of the livestock. "Miriam?" Alex's voice was a broken sob. The eyes on that particular section of the meat mass snapped open. They were the color of summer leaves, just as he remembered. But there was no recognition in them, only a vast, howling void of pain. The mouth below the eyes opened, and instead of a scream, a gout of black, oily bile spilled out, mixing with the protein slurry. "It's too late for her flesh, Alex," Margareth said, her voice hardening. "But her shadow is still in the gears above. And it is angry." The chamber suddenly vibrated with a deep, subsonic boom. From the far end of the labyrinth, a light began to approach, a cold, violet glow that Alex recognized from John's eyes. "The butcher comes," Margareth hissed. "He feels the contamination of our presence. He knows we've seen his gods. We can't just leave them like this," Alex cried, gesturing to the weeping masses. "We have to kill them. We have to burn this place down." "You cannot kill what has never truly lived, nor truly died," Margareth said, grabbing his arm and pulling him back toward the shadows of the organic pipes. "But you can starve them. And you can turn their hunger against their provider." She pulled a small, ancient-looking vial from her bodice, a dark, crystalline liquid that seemed to move on its own. "This is the bile of the first mother. If we can introduce this into the main filtration system, it won't kill the livestock. It will make them hysterical. They will stop recognizing John as their priest and start seeing him as what he truly is." "Meat," Alex finished, his eyes narrowing. The violet light grew closer, casting long, distorted shadows of the livestock against the weeping walls. Alex could hear the rhythmic clack-clack of John's expensive shoes on the spongy floor, a sound that was utterly out of place in this cathedral of gore. "I can smell you." 742, John's voice echoed through the chamber, stripped of its velvet veneer. It was now a jagged, grating sound that resonated with the frequency of the machines. "I can smell the fear. I can smell the jasmine. You've brought a dead girl's ghost into my sanctuary. That is a waste of resources I cannot overlook." Alex and Margareth retreated into a narrow crevice between two pulsating vein pipes. The walls here were warm and wet, smelling of sulfur and old blood. "The ring, Alex," Margareth whispered, her milky eyes flashing one last time with that terrifying pearlescent light. "The ring is the key. It's the conductor for the spirits in the steel. When we get back to the floor, you must throw it into the primary grinder. Not just to break the machine, but to give the ghosts a body to inhabit. A body made of the very meat they were forced to become." "And what about you, Nan?" Alex asked, seeing the exhaustion on her face. "I have seen enough," she said, her voice softening. "I am going to talk to the eyes, Alex. I am going to tell them that the fast is almost over." As John stepped into the main chamber, his silhouette wreathed in a halo of violet energy, Alex took a deep breath of the putrid air. The terror was still there, a cold knot in his chest, but it was being eclipsed by a savage, industrial rage. The Blackwood Canning Company had taken everything from them. Their friends, their dignity, their very humanity. Now, it was time to give something back. Alex watched as John approached the vats, his hand raised in a gesture of grotesque affection toward the pulsating masses. In that moment, Alex saw the boss for what he was, a small, pathetic man playing God in a basement full of rot. The liturgy was ending. The reckoning was about to begin. The ascent from the sub-basement felt like crawling up the throat of a cadaver. While Margareth stayed behind to whisper her ancient, dissonant secrets to the weeping eyes of the livestock, Alex moved upward through the ventilation shafts. The air here was thin, vibrating with the frantic scream of high-pressure turbines. He emerged into a corridor that shouldn't have existed, a hallway of polished obsidian and silent, velvet carpets that stood in stark, mocking contrast to the rusted iron and blood-slicked concrete of the processing floors below. This was the apex, the executive wing where the air was filtered, chilled, and stripped of the scent of sulfur. At the end of the hall stood a door of heavy, dark oak, etched with the same claw-like sigil he had seen on the basement gates. John's office. The door was unlocked, as if the master of the house felt no need for security against the components he owned. As Alex stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The room was circular, with floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out, not toward the town of Oakhaven, but inward, overlooking the vast, hellish expanse of the factory floor. From this height, the workers looked like ants crawling over a necrotic wound. The walls were lined with books. Not the technical manuals or ledger books one would expect from a canning magnate, but volumes bound in a material that made Alex's skin crawl. He approached the desk, a massive slab of petrified wood that looked like a petrified organ. On it lay a stack of journals. Alex reached out, his fingers brushing the cover of the topmost book. It was soft, unnervingly warm, and possessed a fine, pebbled grain. As his flashlight hit the spine, he saw a faint, faded marking, a blue ink tattoo of a sparrow, partially sliced through by the binding. These weren't just books. They were bound in the cured hides of those who had once worked the lines. Alex opened the first ledger, his breath hitching. The handwriting inside was elegant, a flowing copperplate script that detailed the output of the factory. But the output wasn't measured in cans or tons. It was measured in hertz of agony. October 14, 1924, the journal read. The first batch of enriched protein was successful. We discover that the terror of the kill acts as a catalyst. When the subject is aware of their impending dissolution, the adrenal response saturates the muscle fibers. The entity below finds the flavor exquisite. Agony is the secret spice. It is the enzyme that allows the god to wake. Alex flipped through the pages, his horror deepening with every entry. John wasn't just a businessman, he was a high priest of industry, a man who had turned the concept of the assembly line into a liturgical ritual. He had perfected the art of mechanical desecration. The philosophy of the Blackwood lineage is simple, a later entry stated. Humanity is merely a transitional state for energy. We are the refineries. We take the raw, chaotic suffering of the poor and distill it into a pure, concentrated fuel. To the great devourer, a scream is worth more than 1,000 prayers. The machines are designed to prolong the transition, to grind slowly, to sear deliberately, so that not a single drop of spiritual resonance is wasted. Alex's eyes blurred as he read the ingredient lists. He saw names he recognized from the town's missing persons posters spanning decades. But then, he found a section labeled The Legacy of 742. His blood turned to ice. There, in John's elegant script, was a genealogical chart. His grandfather. His father. And finally, his own name, circled in red. The 742 bloodline possesses a rare resonance, John had written. Their nervous systems are uniquely attuned to the factory's infrasonic hum. They don't just feel the pain, they amplify it. Alex is the vintage we have been waiting for. His grief for the girl, the Miriam component, will reach its peak within 48 hours. When we process him, his terror will be the dessert that finally triggers the Great Awakening. He is not a worker. He is the crown jewel of the harvest. A soft, clicking sound echoed in the room. Alex spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There, standing in the shadow of the doorway, was a tall, slender figure. It wasn't John. It was a mannequin-like construction of brass gears and pale, translucent skin, wearing a tattered maid's outfit. Its face was a porcelain mask, frozen in a perpetual, unsettling smile. In its hands, it held a silver tray with a single, steaming cup of the crimson broth. "The master says the reading material is for partners only," a voice emitted from a phonograph-like horn in the figure's neck. It was John's voice, recorded and distorted. "Are you ready to sign the contract, Alex? Or shall we skip straight to the rendering?" Alex backed away toward the glass windows, clutching the ledger to his chest. "You're insane. You're all insane. Insanity is a luxury for the well-fed," the voice crackled. "In the iron womb, there is only the feed. You have seen the history. You have tasted the future. Your friend Miriam is currently being integrated into the primary nervous system of the sub-basement. She is becoming the very floor you walk on. Don't you want to join her? To be part of something eternal?" The mechanical effigy began to move toward him, its joints hissing with hydraulic fluid. Behind it, the door slammed shut. Alex looked down at the factory floor through the glass. He saw the Holy Trinity grinders below, their red lights pulsing like three angry eyes. He saw the steam rising in rhythmic puffs, like the breath of a beast. He wasn't just a victim. He was a conductor. If John wanted his agony to fuel the god, then Alex would give him a surge that would blow every fuse in the factory. He smashed the heavy ledger against the glass. The reinforced pane didn't break, but it cracked, a spider web of white lines spreading across the view of the hell below. "I'm not your dessert, John." Alex roared at the empty room, knowing the boss was watching through 1,000 hidden lenses. "I'm the poison that's going to rot you from the inside out." The effigy lunged, its brass fingers extending into long, needle-like claws. Alex dived over the petrified wood desk, grabbing a heavy iron paperweight, shaped like a meat hook, and swinging it with every ounce of his industrial-born strength. The hook buried itself in the effigy's porcelain face, shattering it into a spray of white shards and black, oily fluid. The machine sputtered, its recording of John's laughter slowing down into a demonic, bass-heavy drone. "Feed me." Alex didn't wait. He threw himself against the cracked glass window with his shoulder. The pane shattered, and he fell, not into the room, but out onto the narrow maintenance gantry that hung hundreds of feet above the primary grinders. The heat hit him like a physical blow. The roar of the machines was deafening, a cacophony of metal teeth and screaming steam. High above, John stepped onto his balcony, his silhouette wreathed in that cold, violet aura. He looked down at Alex, his arms outstretched as if to embrace the chaos. "Run, 742. John shouted, his voice amplified by the factory's internal speakers. "The hunt is the best part. The more you run, the more the meat sweetens. Make me a symphony of terror." Alex scrambled along the gantry, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm that matched the factory's throb. He had the ledger. He had the truth. And he had the silver ring in his pocket, which was now vibrating so hard it felt like it was trying to burrow into his skin. He looked down at the dark, swirling mists of the factory floor. Somewhere down there was Margareth. Somewhere down there were Anna, Bella, and Cindy, the broken fragments of his life. The butcher's ledger was closed. Now, it was time to write the victim's vengeance. Alex descended from the high gantries like a fallen angel returning to a mechanical hell. The butcher's ledger was tucked tightly against his chest, its skin-bound cover vibrating against his ribs as if the souls within were trying to warn him of what lay ahead. As he reached the main floor of the processing bay, the atmosphere had shifted. The air was no longer merely thick with sulfur, it was heavy with a low-frequency vibration, an infrasonic hum so deep it didn't just rattle the ears, it manipulated the heartbeat, forcing the pulse to sync with the factory's relentless throb. This was the hymn of the machine, the sound that stripped the ego from the bone. In the dim, red strobe of the emergency lights, Alex found the sorting line abandoned. But the workers hadn't left. They had been transformed. He found Anna first. She was huddled at a maintenance workbench, surrounded by a pile of jagged scrap metal and rusted rivets. She wasn't weeping. Instead, she was humming a flat, toneless melody that matched the frequency of the boilers. Her movements were precise, clinical, and utterly insane. "Anna?" Alex whispered, stepping into the circle of her shadow. She turned, and the breath died in Alex's throat. Anna had used an industrial stapler to attach strips of galvanized tin to her forearms. The metal was biting deep into her skin, the edges rimmed with dark, congealing blood. Her left eye was clouded, not by a cataract like Margaretha's, but by a shard of polished brass she had forced beneath her eyelid to correct her vision. "Flesh is a design flaw, Alex," she whispered, her voice sounding like dry gravel. She didn't look at him with her human eye, she tilted her head so the brass shard could reflect the flickering red light. "The master showed me. We are leaky vessels. Too soft. Too much water. I'm upgrading. I'm becoming a permanent part of the quota." She picked up a heavy, jagged gear and pressed it against her bicep. With a sickening thud crunch, she used a mallet to drive a bolt through the center of the gear and into her own bone. She didn't flinch. A horrific, beatific smile spread across her face. "I can feel the gears now, Alex. I'm finally efficient." "Anna, stop. This isn't you." Alex lunged forward to grab the mallet, but she pushed him back with a strength that felt cold and artificial. "Don't touch the hardware," she hissed, her eyes wide and devoid of any human recognition. "I am 743. I am a subassembly. Go to the boilers, Alex. The sisters are already singing. They are receiving the great heat." Terrified, Alex backed away, leaving Anna to her self-mutilation. He followed the sound of a rhythmic, collective moaning that seemed to come from the very center of the factory, where the primary steam boilers rose like black, obsidian towers. The scene at the boilers was a tableau of industrial desecration. Bella and Cindy were there, stripped to their undergarments, their skin glistening with a mixture of grease and sweat. They were knelt before the massive, vibrating pipes that fed the high-pressure steam into the vats. These pipes were scalding, coated in a thin layer of white frost from the chemical reactions within, yet radiating a heat that should have been unbearable. They were worshipping the heat. "It is the breath of the god," Cindy chanted, her body swaying in a trance-like fervor. "The heat is the love. The heat is the truth." Alex watched in paralyzed horror as Bella leaned forward and pressed her lips against the glowing iron pipe. There was a sickening hiss, the sound of moisture turning instantly to steam, and the smell of burning flesh filled the air. Bella didn't pull away. She stayed there, her eyes rolling back into her head in an ecstatic, agonizing trance. When she finally pulled back, her lips were gone, replaced by raw, blistering sores that had begun to fuse with the iron scale of the pipe. She smiled, a red, toothy grin that looked like a jagged wound. "It tastes like gold, Alex," Bella gurgled, her voice a wet, ruined whistle. "The pipe, it spoke to me. It said I'm delicious." Cindy followed, kissing the pipe with a desperate hunger, her fingers clawing at the rivets until her nails bled. They were no longer women, they were acolytes of a metallic cult, their minds hollowed out by the infrasonic hum and replaced by the primal, screaming logic of the factory. "They've been integrated," a voice rasped from the shadows behind Alex. He spun around to find Edgar. But the supervisor looked different. His waxy skin was sloughing off in large, gray flakes, revealing a network of copper wires and black, pulsating tubing beneath. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He stood perfectly still, his hollow eyes fixed on the girls. "The resonance is perfect," Edgar said, his voice now a perfect mimicry of the boiler's hum. "When the psyche breaks, the spirit becomes a superconductor. Their pain is no longer theirs, it is being broadcasted directly to the sub-basement. The livestock is growing fat on their hysteria. You did this to them." Alex screamed, brandishing the heavy iron paperweight he had stolen from John's office. "The factory did this," Edgar corrected. "I am merely the lubricant. John is the spark. And you, Alex, you are the fuel." Suddenly, the boilers let out a violent, ear-piercing shriek of escaping steam. The sound was so loud it felt like a physical blow. Bella and Cindy collapsed into each other, their charred faces pressed together, weeping tears of black oil. The infrasonic hum intensified, reaching a crescendo that made the floor tiles buckle. Alex felt his own mind beginning to fray. Images of the livestock, the titanic meat masses with their weeping eyes, began to flash in his mind's eye, superimposed over the reality of the factory floor. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to join the girls, to press his own flesh against the burning steel and let the pain wash away the burden of being human. "Alex." It was Margaretha's voice, but it wasn't coming from the room. It was a psychic anchor, pulling him back from the edge of the industrial abyss. "The silver, Alex. The silver doesn't burn. It reflects." Alex reached into his pocket and gripped the silver ring. The metal was ice cold, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the room. As his fingers closed around it, the infrasonic hum seemed to dampen, the red strobes of the factory losing their hypnotic power. He looked at Anna, who was now trying to rivet a metal plate to her own forehead. He looked at Bella and Cindy, lost in their ecstatic agony. He realized then that he couldn't save them. Their souls had already been processed, their identities rendered down into the great feed. "I'm sorry," Alex whispered, the words tasting like ash. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry," Edgar said, stepping closer, his copper-veined hand reaching out. "Be useful. The primary grinder is waiting for its centerpiece. John has prepared a special place for you in the symphony." Alex didn't run away this time. He looked at the supervisor, then at the shattered girls, and finally at the butcher's ledger in his hand. The grief that John had hoped to harvest was there, but it was no longer sweet. It had fermented into a toxic, volatile rage. "If I'm the fuel, Edgar," Alex said, his voice dangerously low, "then I'm going to be the kind that makes the whole engine explode." He didn't wait for Edgar to react. Alex turned and sprinted toward the main processing bay, heading for the heart of the Holy Trinity grinders. Behind him, he could hear the girls beginning to scream, not in pain, but in a horrific, rhythmic chant, calling for the Great Awakening. The factory was no longer just a workplace or even a slaughterhouse. It was a temple in the midst of a bloody, metallic ritual. And as Alex ran, he could feel the ghost of Miriam running beside him, her faceless form flickering in the steam, her missing finger pointing toward the final, crushing gears of destiny. The shattering was complete. The symphony was approaching its final movement. The basement's hum had followed Alex upward, but here, in the heart of the primary processing bay, the sound had curdled. It was no longer a vibration of metal, it was a vibration of will. The air was thick enough to chew, saturated with the smell of ozone, rancid fat, and a new, overwhelming scent, the sweet, cloying aroma of jasmine mixed with the stench of stagnant, sun-heated tar. Alex skidded to a halt on the maintenance bridge overlooking the Holy Trinity, the three massive, primary grinders that acted as the factory's heart. Below him, the floor was drowned in a sea of black, industrial oil. A pipe must have burst, but the oil wasn't flowing toward the drains. It was swirling in slow, concentric circles, defying the laws of fluid dynamics. It was shimmering with a sickly, iridescent rainbow sheen, a spectral film that looked like the skin of a dead star. "Do you hear it, Alex?" The voice didn't come from behind him. It came from the oil itself. Alex looked down. From the black depths of the oil slick, shapes were beginning to emerge. They didn't rise like bubbles, they rose like sculptures being carved out of shadows. First came the heads, featureless, obsidian spheres that slowly sprouted the hollow pits of eyes and the jagged gashes of mouths. Then came the limbs. Long, spindly arms made of liquid grease reached upward, clawing at the air. "Miriam?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling. One of the shapes drifted toward the center of the slick. It was taller than the others, more defined. As the oil drained from its face, the features of Miriam appeared, not as she was, but as a caricature of her agony. Her skin was the color of a bruise, her hair long, dripping strands of black sludge. She had no eyes, only two glowing violet embers that mirrored the light from John's office. "We are the lubricant, Alex," the oil Miriam spoke, her voice a chorus of 100 drowned souls. "We are the friction that keeps the world turning." But the master forgot, oil is flammable. Suddenly, the Holy Trinity grinders began to turn. There was no one at the controls. The heavy iron levers were locked in the OFF position, yet the massive, serrated drums began to rotate with a ferocity that shook the foundations of the building. The sound was no longer a mechanical roar. The gears were grinding against each other in a rhythmic, syllabic cadence. Krrak. SSSLay. Masister. Fidi. It was a mechanical liturgy, a chant of 1,000 teeth. The shadows in the room began to disconnect from the machines, stretching across the walls like ink spilled on parchment. They danced a frantic, violent jig, mimicking the motions of workers being pulled into the maws of the grinders. "The fast is over," a piercing cry rang out. Margareth appeared at the edge of the central vat. She looked transformed. Her grease-stained shawl had been cast aside, revealing a body that seemed to be glowing from within. Her cataracts were gone, replaced by twin beacons of blinding, pearlescent light that cut through the sulphurous fog like searchlights. She wasn't just a medium anymore, she was the conductor of the factory's ghost. "I summon the spirit of the grinder," she roared, her voice amplified by the supernatural pressure of the room. She threw her hands wide, and the black oil on the floor responded by leaping upward in massive, jagged spikes. "I summon the broken bones and the rendered fat. I summon the screams that were canned and labeled for profit." The oil wraiths began to climb the machinery. They flowed over the gears like liquid obsidian, their touch causing the metal to rust and pit instantly. Where they passed, the machines didn't just break, they mutated. The iron rollers grew jagged, bone-like protrusions. The conveyor belts turned into long, leathery tongues that lashed out at the empty air. The spirit of the grinder was no longer a metaphor. A massive, spectral entity was forming above the Trinity, a titan of smoke, oil, and jagged metal fragments. It had no face, only a yawning, rotating vortex of teeth that mirrored the machines below. "Where is he, Margareth?" the spirit voice boomed, shaking the very bolts out of the walls. "Where's the one who fed us to the dark?" "He is in his tower." Margareth pointed upward toward the glass office. "He is watching his masterpiece. Show him the final product." Alex looked up and saw John. The boss was standing at the edge of his shattered window, his face pale, his violet aura flickering like a dying candle. For the first time, John looked small. He looked like a man who had realized that the god he had been feeding had finally developed a taste for its priest. John raised a hand, trying to channel the energy of the livestock below to command the ghosts, but the oil wraiths didn't obey. They hissed, a sound like 1,000 steam valves opening at once. "The livestock is hungry, John," Alex shouted, his voice caught in the supernatural gale. "But they're not waiting for the cans anymore. They want the source." Suddenly, the shadows on the wall lunged. They didn't strike John, they struck his office. The heavy obsidian walls began to crumble as the spectral oil seeped into the stone, rotting it from the inside out. John scrambled back, but the office floor, his sanctuary, was turning into a mire of black sludge. The oil Miriam appeared through the floor, her liquid fingers grasping at his expensive leather shoes. "Get away from me!" John screamed, his voice cracking. "I am the architect. I am the one who gave you purpose. You gave us an end, John," Miriam's voice echoed, cold and pitiless. "Now, we give you a beginning. A beginning that never ends." The primary grinder below, the one Alex had nearly died in, opened its hatch. It wasn't a mechanical opening, the steel simply peeled back like skin. The interior glowed with an intense, sickly green light, and the spirit of the grinder leaned down, its vortex of teeth spinning with a sound that was now a pure, undistorted scream of everyone who had ever died in Oakhaven. Margareth turned to Alex, her glowing eyes softening for a brief second. "Run to the control hub, Alex. The ring. You must bridge the circuit. Give the ghosts the power to solidify. If you don't, John will slip through the shadows again." Alex sprinted along the vibrating gantry, his boots slipping on the ectoplasmic oil that was now dripping from the ceiling. He reached the central hub, the brain of the factory. It was a massive brass sphere, covered in thousands of glowing vacuum tubes and twitching needles. He pulled the silver ring from his pocket. It was no longer just a ring, it was a conduit, glowing with a fierce, white light that burned his palm. "For Miriam," he roared. He jammed the silver ring into the main power bus, bridging the gap between the industrial electricity and the supernatural resonance of the ghosts. The effect was instantaneous. A massive bolt of white lightning erupted from the ring, arcing across the factory floor. It hit the oil wraiths, turning their liquid forms into solid, shimmering statues of vengeful silver and black. The spirit of the grinder solidified, its metallic teeth becoming real, physical blades that ground against each other with a deafening crunch. The entire factory groaned, a sound of immense, structural agony. Up in the office, the floor finally gave way. John plummeted. He didn't fall far, the oil wraiths caught him in midair, their silver-slicked hands gripping his limbs with the force of hydraulic presses. They began to drag him down. Not toward the floor, but toward the open, hungry mouth of the primary grinder. "No! Please!" John's screams were broadcasted through every speaker in the factory, amplified by the very system he had used to terrorize his workers. "I can give you more. I can find more subjects. I'll give you Oakhaven. I'll give you everything." "We already have everything, John," Margareth said, her voice echoing through the chamber like a funeral bell. "We have the truth. And the truth is, you're just protein." As John was lowered toward the spinning blades, the oil Miriam leaned in close to his ear. Alex could see her translucent, shimmering lips move, though the sound was drowned out by the roar of the machine. Then, the first blade touched his foot. The scream that followed was not human. It was the sound of a god's priest being unmade, a sound that Alex knew would haunt his dreams for as long as he lived. But as he watched, he didn't feel pity. He felt a cold, industrial satisfaction. The oil-slicked wraiths began to hum the same dissonant tune Margareth had been singing. It was a lullaby for the dying. The gears turned. The teeth bit. And as the spirit of the grinder began to consume its master, the black oil on the floor began to glow with a brilliant, cleansing white light. The symphony was almost over. But the dessert was just being served. The factory was no longer a place of production, it was a dying animal, thrashing in the throes of a cataclysmic fever. The silver ring Alex had jammed into the control hub had created a feedback loop that the Blackwood Canning Company could not contain. Steam pipes, once the rigid veins of the facility, were now bursting with the sound of cannon fire, geysers of scalding, pressurized vapor turning the main floor into a lethal, white-out labyrinth. Alex stumbled through the mist, his lungs burning with every breath. The butcher's ledger was tucked under his arm, its human skin cover now weeping a dark, oily sweat as it reacted to the supernatural heat. "Alex." The voice didn't come from the speakers. It was a jagged, predatory snarl that echoed off the vibrating steel walls. John emerged from a wall of steam 20 feet ahead. He was no longer the immaculate high priest of industry. His charcoal suit was shredded, revealing skin that had begun to take on a metallic, iridescent sheen. His eyes were no longer pits of shadow, they were twin furnaces of violet fire, and his fingers had elongated into blackened, obsidian talons. He had escaped the immediate reach of the oil wraiths, fueled by the very dark energy he had spent a lifetime harvesting. "You've broken the cycle, 742, John hissed, his voice vibrating with a subsonic frequency that made the floor beneath Alex's boots groan. "You've turned the meal into a riot. Do you have any idea how much effort it takes to refine a soul? You've wasted decades of harvesting in a single moment of petty, human spite. John lunged. He moved with a jerky, stop-motion speed, his body flickering in and out of the steam. Alex dived behind a heavy-duty cooling vat just as John's talons raked through the metal where his head had been a second before, leaving deep, glowing gouges that hissed with corrosive energy. The livestock is screaming, Alex. John roared, his silhouette looming over the vat. They are hungry. And since you've denied them their protein, I think I'll offer them your grandmother's heart as an apology. You won't touch her. Alex yelled, scrambling toward the conveyor alley, a narrow corridor of fast-moving belts designed to transport the heavy cans to the shipping dock. The alley was a death trap. In the chaos, the sensors had failed, and the belts were moving at a suicidal velocity. Cans were flying off the line like shrapnel, shattering against the walls and spraying the special batch stew everywhere. Alex jumped onto a moving catwalk, his heart hammering against his ribs. Below him, the primary conveyor belt, a massive, serrated ribbon of reinforced rubber, was bucking and snapping like a whipped snake. Supervisor. John's voice boomed, calling out into the mist. Intercept him. Final directive, eviscerate. From the shadows of the steam pipes, Edgar appeared. The Mander was a ruin of a man. The copper wires beneath his skin were sparking, and black bile leaked from his ears and nose. He moved like a puppet with tangled strings, his eyes vacant and dead. He blocked the end of the catwalk, a heavy industrial cleaver in his hand. Out of my way, Edgar! Alex screamed, clutching the iron paperweight. Edgar didn't speak. He stepped forward, his gait stiff and mechanical. But as he reached the edge of the catwalk, the factory chose that moment to claim its most loyal servant. A massive steam pipe directly above the conveyor belt exploded. The force of the blast knocked the catwalk sideways, throwing Edgar off balance. He fell, his scream lost in the roar of escaping pressure. He didn't hit the floor. He hit the primary conveyor belt. The mechanical brutality was senseless and instantaneous. Edgar's arm was caught first, pulled into the heavy steel rollers that powered the belt. Alex watched in a trance of frozen horror as the machine, no longer recognizing its master or its maker, began to pull Edgar in. Sirrak. The sound of his humorous snapping was like a dry branch breaking. The belt didn't stop. It accelerated. Edgar's body was twisted like a rag, his legs dangling over the side as the serrated rubber teeth of the belt began to grind his torso against the stationary steel frame of the line. No, help! Edgar's voice was a wet, static-filled gargle. The belt gave a violent lurch. With a sound of wet tearing, like heavy canvas being ripped, Edgar was literally torn in half. His upper torso was dragged into the dark maw of the packaging unit, while his lower half remained slumped on the floor, leaking black, oily fluid instead of blood. There was no dignity in his death, no grand sacrifice. He was simply a component that had been discarded by the very system he had worshipped. John stopped at the edge of the broken catwalk, staring down at the mangled remains of his supervisor. A flicker of something, disgust or perhaps the realization of his own mortality, passed over his monstrous face. He was inefficient, John muttered, his violet eyes refocusing on Alex. Alex didn't wait. He used the distraction to leap from the catwalk onto a cluster of vibrating steam pipes. He climbed higher, into the rafters, where the heat was so intense his skin began to blister. You can't hide in the heat, Alex. John called out, his voice echoing through the vapor labyrinth. I am the heat. I am the pressure. I am the Blackwood Canning Company.